The smell of burnt grass woke Daniel Reeves before his alarm ever could. He lived alone on a small piece of land at the edge of a quiet town, far enough from his neighbors that strange smells usually meant one of two things: a wildfire starting somewhere in the dry hills, or his old tractor engine leaking oil onto a hot pipe again. He sat up in bed, rubbed his eyes, and looked out the window. The sky outside was still dark, but there was a strange orange glow coming from behind his barn, low and flickering, like something was burning close to the ground. He pulled on his boots without bothering to tie them and grabbed the flashlight he kept by the door, more out of habit than real worry. Daniel had spent years fixing broken machines for a living before he retired early, tired of noisy workshops and louder people. Out here, the only sounds he wanted to hear were whined through the fence posts and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Whatever was glowing behind his barn was about to ruin that peace, and he already knew it. When he rounded the corner of the barn, he stopped walking. The ground had been torn open in a long, shallow scar that ended in a wide, blackened circle, as if something heavy had skidded across his field before finally stopping. Smoke curled up from patches of scorched grass. In the middle of the crater sat something that did not belong there, something the size of a small car, smooth and dark, with cracks running across its surface like a dropped egg. It was still glowing faintly, cooling from whatever heat had carried it down from the sky. Daniel stood at the edge of the crater for a long moment, flashlight beam shaking slightly in his hand. He told himself it was probably some kind of weather balloon equipment, or maybe a piece of a satellite that had fallen out of orbit. People online were always talking about space junk falling somewhere in the world. He almost turned around to call it in and let someone else deal with it. Almost. Then he heard the sound. It was a thin, high chirp, not quite like a bird and not quite like anything else he had heard before. It came from inside the cracked shell. He froze, listening, and it came again, weaker this time, followed by a second chirp answering the first. Something alive was in there. Against every reasonable thought in his head telling him to walk away, Daniel stepped down into the crater. The heat still radiating off the ground pressed against his boots. Up close, the shell was not metal, not exactly. It felt more like thick, leathery bone, warm under his fingers. He found a long crack near the top, and, carefully, pried it wider with his hands. The shell gave way easier than he expected, crumbling at the edges like burnt paper. Inside, curled together for warmth, were two small creatures unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. They were roughly the size of house cats, with narrow, scaled bodies, folded wings pressed tight against their backs, and long tails that wrapped around each other like a knot. Their skin was a deep, ash gray, dulled by soot, but even in the dim light, he could see faint golden veins running just beneath the surface, pulsing weakly like tiny heartbeats. One of them lifted its head toward him, blinking slowly, eyes glowing a soft amber in the dark. Daniel's first instinct was to step back. His second instinct, the one that actually won, was to reach in and gently scoop them both into his jacket. They were cold despite the heat of the crater around them, shivering in a way that reminded him of newborn calves left out too long in a storm. Whatever they were, wherever they had come from, they were not going to survive the night out here alone. He carried them back to the house cradled against his chest, boots crunching over blackened grass, half convinced he would wake up soon and realize this was some strange dream brought on by too much late-night television. But the weight in his arms stayed real, and so did the small, warm bodies pressed against him, trembling less with every step closer to the porch light. Inside, he laid them down near the fireplace on an old folded blanket and got a fire going, feeding it slowly until the room filled with warmth. The two creatures uncurled bit by bit, stretching thin legs and small clawed feet, sniffing at the air like they were trying to understand this strange new place they had landed in. Daniel sat on the floor across from them, elbows on his knees, staring at the two impossible things he had just carried into his living room. He should call someone. A biologist. The county office. Maybe even the news. Instead, he found himself reaching for a bowl, filling it with warm water, and setting it gently in front of them, the way he might for an injured barn cat. The smaller of the two crept forward first, sniffing at his outstretched hand before pressing its small head against his palm. A soft, rumbling sound came from its chest, almost like a purr. The second one, bolder, climbed straight into his lap without any hesitation at all, curling up like it had always belonged there. Daniel sat very still, afraid that moving might scare them both away. Outside, the crater in his backyard still smoldered under the stars, a scar in the earth that would raise questions come morning. But right now, in the orange light of the fireplace, none of that mattered yet. Two small, shivering strangers from somewhere far beyond his fence line had decided, without asking permission, that this quiet, tired man was going to be the one who kept them safe. He had no idea yet how right they were. 3 weeks in, Daniel Reeves had already broken every rule he had ever set for himself about keeping his life simple. His kitchen table, once used for nothing but coffee mugs and unpaid bills, was now covered in notebooks filled with messy handwriting, timestamps, and sketches of two small creatures in different poses. He had never planned on becoming someone who tracked feeding times and growth measurements, but somewhere between the second week and the third, that was exactly what he had become. He had named them, which was probably the moment he stopped pretending this was temporary. The bolder one, always first to explore, first to knock things off shelves, and first to demand food, he called Flint, after the way sparks seemed to jump off its scales when it got excited. The smaller, quieter one, who preferred to watch from a distance before doing anything, he named Glimmer, for the soft golden light that flickered faintly under her skin whenever she was calm. In just 3 weeks, both of them had nearly doubled in size. Daniel had raised farm animals before, calves and lambs that grew fast in their first months, but nothing like this. Flint, who had barely reached his knee the first night, now stood almost waist height, with wings that had gone from useless folded flaps to twitching, half-functional limbs he clearly wanted to test. Glimmer grew slower, but stranger. Small sparks of static jumped between her claws when she was startled, enough to leave the hair on Daniel's arm standing up if he was too close. He kept them hidden as best he could, mostly in the barn during the day and the house at night, but a farm at the edge of town was never as private as people like to think. Warrenlock, the local wildlife containment officer, had already stopped by twice, asking questions about strange sounds neighbors claimed to have heard drifting from Daniel's property. Daniel gave him vague answers about coyotes and broken machinery, and so far, Warren seemed more annoyed than suspicious. That would not last forever, and Daniel knew it. What worried him more than Warrenlock, though, was the word Flint had started saying. It began as a sound, nothing more, a short chirp that happened whenever Daniel walked into a room. Over time, the chirp shaped itself into something rougher, something closer to a real word. By the end of the second week, there was no mistaking it anymore. Flint would look straight at him, tilt his head, and say, "Clear as anything, Dad." The first time it happened, Daniel had nearly dropped the plate he was holding. He told himself it was a coincidence, some random sound that happened to land close to a word he recognized. But Flint said it again the next morning, and the morning after that, every single time Daniel came near. Not long after, Glimmer picked it up too, quieter, softer, but just as clear. Daniel did not know what these creatures were. He suspected, though he had not said it out loud to anyone, not even to himself in a full sentence, that they were not from Earth at all. No animal grew this fast. No animal had veins that glowed. No animal skidded down out of a night sky wrapped in a shell built like nothing found in any zoo or textbook. But whatever they were, wherever they had come from, they had decided, without asking him, that he was their father. He started reading everything he could get his hands on, staying up late with his old laptop searching through obscure science forums and half-serious conspiracy pages about unexplained sightings and strange lights reported near his county. Most of it was nonsense, wild guesses dressed up as facts. But one detail kept repeating across different sources he found, buried in comment sections and forgotten local news archives. Reports of a bright object crossing the sky the same night the crater appeared behind his barn. Daniel began keeping a private log, separate from the notebooks about feeding schedules. This one focused only on their behavior. He wrote down every strange thing he noticed. How Flint's scales darkened slightly when he was scared, the way both of them seemed to sense storms hours before the sky changed, and how Glimmer, despite being the smaller and quieter of the two, always positioned herself between Flint and any unfamiliar sound outside, as if some instinct told her to protect him. He noticed something else too, something he was slower to admit even in his private notes. He had started talking to them the way he used to talk to himself when he lived alone, filling silence out of habit. Except now, they listened. Flint would tilt his head at the sound of Daniel's voice, and Glimmer would press against his leg when his tone dropped low with worry. Somewhere in those 3 strange weeks, without ever meaning to, Daniel had stopped being a man simply caring for 2 lost animals. He had started being something closer to a father, whether that word made any logical sense or not. Late one evening, as he sat on the porch steps watching the 2 of them chase each other clumsily across the yard, wings flapping uselessly but wildly, Daniel found himself laughing out loud for the first time in longer than he could remember. Flint tripped over his own tail and rolled into the grass, and Glimmer pounced on top of him with an excited chirp before both of them scrambled up and ran straight back toward Daniel, calling out the same word they always used now, over and over, happy and certain. Dad, Dad, Dad. He did not have an answer yet for what they were, or where they had come from, or what might come looking for them someday. But sitting there in the fading light, with 2 impossible creatures climbing into his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world, Daniel decided that whatever answers eventually came, he was not giving them up without a fight. The static came before anything else, cutting through the late-night radio broadcast Daniel had been half listening to while he repaired a fence post in the barn. He almost didn't notice it at first, just a rough crackle over the local weather report, gone as quickly as it appeared. It was the second time that week he had heard it, and the second time Flint's head had snapped up from where he lay curled near the workbench, ears, or whatever passed for ears on him, twitching toward the sound. Daniel set down his tools and watched the 2 of them carefully. Glimmer, who had been chewing lazily on a strip of old leather, went suddenly still, her golden veins flickering brighter under her skin. Both of them turned their heads at the exact same moment, tilting upward, toward the roof of the barn, toward the sky beyond it. It was not the first time they had done this, but it was the first time Daniel let himself really think about what it meant. Something out there was calling to them, and they were starting to hear it clearly. Over the following days, the strange radio interference became harder to ignore. The local news station Daniel kept on in the kitchen each morning ran a short segment about unexplained signal disruptions affecting weather satellites across 3 counties. The anchor read it almost as a joke, blaming old equipment and technical glitches, but Daniel noticed the segment kept getting longer each day instead of disappearing the way most local news stories usually did. He wasn't the only one paying attention. At a small diner in town, where Daniel had gone for the first time in weeks just to remind himself what normal human conversation sounded like, he overheard 2 truck drivers at the next table talking in low voices about a strange pulse repeating in a fixed pattern, picked up on emergency radio bands. One of them, a heavy-set man with a faded cap, leaned in and said he'd heard from a cousin working out near the coast that the pattern wasn't random at all, that some folks with the right equipment were calling it a signal, not noise. Daniel kept his eyes on his coffee and said nothing, but his stomach had gone tight and cold. That night, he sat outside on the porch steps with Flint and Glimmer pressed close on either side of him, watching the stars the way he had started doing more and more often lately. The sky was clear, unusually so for the season, and somewhere far above the ordinary scattering of stars, something new blinked steadily, faint but out of place, moving slower than any satellite Daniel had ever tracked with his old telescope. Flint made a sound low in his throat, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between longing and recognition. Glimmer pressed tighter against Daniel's side, her small claws digging gently into the fabric of his jacket. He didn't need a science degree to understand what he was looking at. Whatever had sent these 2 creatures crashing into his backyard weeks ago was still out there, and it was getting closer. Word about the strange pulse eventually spread beyond truck drivers and late-night radio hosts. A government vehicle, plain and unmarked except for a small insignia on the side door, rolled slowly past Daniel's property one afternoon while he was out repairing the same fence he never seemed to finish fixing. It didn't stop, but it slowed enough for Daniel to notice the driver studying his land a little too carefully before continuing on down the road. He didn't mention it to anyone, but he moved Flint and Glimmer's usual daytime spot from the open barn to the reinforced root cellar beneath the house that same evening, an old storm shelter he hadn't used in years. Neither of them liked the change. Flint paced the small space restlessly, and Glimmer refused to settle until Daniel sat down on the floor with them, back against the cold stone wall, staying until they finally drifted off to sleep against him. Sleep did not come easily for Daniel that night. He lay awake going over everything he had pieced together so far. Two creatures, clearly not from Earth, growing far too fast to be natural, responding to a signal that was now drawing outside attention. If people were noticing strange radio pulses and unmarked vehicles were already driving past his land, it meant whatever was coming was not far off anymore, and he had very little time left to decide what he was going to do about it. He thought about calling someone, some official number, some agency that might actually know what was happening and could offer real answers instead of guesses pieced together from late-night forums and diner gossip. But every time he pictured that call, he pictured what would happen after. Strangers in uniforms taking Flint and Glimmer away in cages, treating them like specimens instead of the two small, scared creatures who fell asleep every night pressed against him, calling him Dad like it was the only word that mattered. He wasn't going to make that call. Instead, in the days that followed, Daniel quietly started preparing his land the way he once prepared for storms, back when he still worked as an engineer fixing equipment out in the field before things got too complicated to stay simple. He checked the old generator in the barn, made sure fuel reserves were full, reinforced the cellar door, and kept a bag packed near the front entrance with basic supplies, just in case leaving quickly ever became necessary. Above him, the strange light in the sky grew brighter each night, slow and steady, unmistakably drawing closer to Earth. Whatever it was, whoever or whatever was inside it, was not stopping. Flint and Glimmer sensed it more clearly with each passing evening, restless and alert in a way they had never been before. Daniel stood in his backyard on the last quiet night before everything changed, staring up at that steady light, two small creatures pressed against his legs, watching the same spot in the sky with him. He did not know yet what was coming, whether it meant danger or an answer to every question he had been quietly gathering for weeks. But he knew, standing there in the cold night air, that whatever arrived, he was not backing down from it. Every dog in the county started barking at the exact same moment, and Daniel Reeves knew, before he even reached the window, that this was the night he had been quietly bracing for. He had been sitting up late, unable to sleep, running through the same worries he had circled for days, when the low hum began. It wasn't loud at first, more of a pressure in the air than an actual sound, the kind of feeling that made his ears pop and the water glass on his table ripple in small, steady rings. Flint and Glimmer, curled together near the fireplace, shot upright at the same instant, wings snapping open fully for the first time Daniel had ever seen, both of them letting out sharp, urgent cries toward the ceiling. Daniel grabbed his flashlight out of pure habit, though he already knew it would be useless for whatever was coming. He stepped out onto the porch just as the sky above his property split open with light, not lightning, but something steady and controlled, a bright line cutting down from high above the clouds, growing wider and brighter as it descended directly toward his land. He barely had time to shout for the two of them to get back before the ground shook. Something enormous came down in his backyard, past the barn, in the same open field where the small crater had first appeared weeks earlier. This was no small pod this time. Trees along the property line bent and snapped from the force of the landing, and a wave of hot wind rolled across the yard, carrying dust and torn grass with it. Daniel shielded his eyes, coughing, and when he lowered his arm again, he understood, all at once, exactly where Flint and Glimmer had come from. The creature standing in his backyard was massive, easily taller than his barn, with wings folded along a long, powerful body covered in dark scales that shimmered faintly under the moonlight, the same deep gray as Flint and Glimmer's, but crossed now with thick lines of glowing gold. Its head turned slowly, sweeping the property with eyes that burned bright amber, sharp and searching, until they landed directly on Daniel, standing frozen on his porch steps. He should have run. Every instinct screaming through his body told him to run. Instead, before he could stop them, Flint and Glimmer shot past him across the yard, wings flapping clumsily but desperately, crying out sounds Daniel had never heard from them before, raw and overjoyed. The massive creature lowered its head instantly, a deep rumble rolling out of its chest, no longer a threatening sound, but something closer to relief. Flint and Glimmer crashed into her outstretched claws, climbing over each other to press against her. And for a long moment, the three of them stayed like that, wrapped together in the wreckage of Daniel's backyard, while Daniel stood frozen on the porch, heart pounding, watching a reunion he somehow understood without needing words. Then the massive head lifted again, and those amber eyes locked back onto him. Daniel's mouth went dry. He had spent weeks preparing supplies, reinforcing his cellar, coming up with plans for government agents and curious neighbors, but nothing had prepared him for standing this close to something that could crush his entire house without much effort. Still, some stubborn part of him, the same part that had carried two strange, shivering creatures out of a smoking crater without a second thought, kept his feet planted exactly where they were. He stepped down off the porch, slowly, hands open and empty at his sides, the way he might approach a spooked horse. Flint and Glimmer immediately broke away from their mother and ran back toward him, one on each side, pressing against his legs the same way they always did, chirping the same familiar word up at him. Dad. The massive creature's head tilted, and for a long, tense moment, nothing moved. Daniel could feel his own heartbeat in his throat. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lowered her head even further, closer to his height, until those glowing eyes were nearly level with his own. She studied him in silence, long enough that Daniel began to wonder if this was the last quiet moment of his life. Instead, she exhaled a long, warm breath that smelled faintly of ash and something sweeter underneath, and one massive claw, easily the size of Daniel's entire torso, extended toward him, not to strike, but to touch, gently, almost carefully, against his chest, exactly where Flint and Glimmer always pressed their heads when they wanted comfort. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Somehow, impossibly, this enormous creature understood. She had come across unknown distances searching for her lost young, prepared, Daniel suspected, for almost anything except this. Instead of finding them frightened, starved, or gone, she found them healthy, growing, and clinging to a single exhausted human who had done nothing but keep them warm and safe without expecting anything in return. Daniel reached up slowly and rested his hand against the massive claw resting on his chest. I kept them safe, he said quietly, unsure if she understood a single word, but needing to say it anyway. Both of them. I didn't know what they were. I just couldn't leave them out there. The creature made a low sound deep in her throat, almost like a sigh, and pulled her claw back gently before lowering herself down onto the torn grass of Daniel's backyard, folding her enormous wings against her sides, settling in like she had no intention of leaving anytime soon. Flint and Glimmer immediately climbed up onto her back, chirping happily, before both of them turned and looked back at Daniel, clearly waiting for him to join them. Daniel glanced back toward his house, toward the quiet, ordinary life he had lived there for years before any of this happened, and then back at the three creatures now settled in his backyard, watching him with patient, expectant eyes. Whatever this was, whatever came next, Daniel understood one thing clearly as he walked forward across the broken grass toward them. His quiet life was over, and he wasn't sure he wanted it back. By sunrise, half the county already knew something had landed on Daniel Reeves's property, and by noon, so did the government. Daniel hadn't slept. He had spent the night sitting in the torn-up grass of his backyard, leaning against the massive, warm side of the creature Flint and Glimmer clearly considered their mother, watching the sky slowly turn from black to gray to a pale, uncertain blue. Every so often, she shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the two hatchlings curled asleep against her, and each time, Daniel felt the ground tremble faintly beneath him, a quiet reminder of exactly how much power was resting peacefully just a few feet away. The sound of engines broke the calm just after 9 in the morning. Daniel stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans, as a line of dark, unmarked vehicles rolled up his gravel driveway and stopped just short of the broken fence line. Doors opened in near-perfect unison, and armed personnel in tactical gear spread out along the edge of his property, weapons lowered but ready, forming a loose circle around the enormous creature, now lifting her head to study the new arrivals with sharp, wary eyes. At the front of the group walked a woman in a plain gray uniform, no obvious rank markings beyond a small insignia pinned to her collar, moving with the calm, measured steps of someone used to giving orders and having them followed instantly. She stopped several yards from Daniel, studying him, then the creature behind him, then the two smaller ones now awake and pressed protectively against Daniel's legs. "Colonel Ada Marsh," she said simply, not offering a hand. "I'm going to assume you understand why we're here, Mr. Reeves." Daniel kept his voice steady, though his heart was hammering. "This is my property." "It was," Marsh replied evenly, glancing toward the massive creature behind him. "Until whatever that is decided to land in your backyard. We've had unexplained signal activity building for weeks. That thing crossed half a solar system to get here. You understand this isn't a local matter anymore." Behind Daniel, a low growl rumbled from deep in the creature's chest, and every soldier along the fence line tensed, weapons rising slightly. Flint and Glimmer pressed tighter against Daniel's legs, small bodies trembling, and Daniel raised both hands slowly, first toward the soldiers, then turning halfway toward the creature behind him. "Easy," he said quietly, unsure if the word was meant more for the massive dragon or the armed strangers surrounding his home. Somehow, both seemed to understand him. The growling faded into a low, watchful silence, and the soldiers' weapons lowered again, though not by much. Colonel Marsh studied the exchange carefully, something shifting behind her controlled expression. "It listens to you." "They," Daniel corrected. "Not it. They listened because I've spent weeks keeping her children alive and warm after they fell out of the sky into my backyard with nobody else around to help them. That's not something you train for in a manual." Marsh's jaw tightened slightly. "We can't leave an armed, unknown alien life form sitting on unsecured civilian land, Mr. Reeves. I have orders to contain and transport all 3 specimens for evaluation." "They're not specimens," Daniel said, sharper now. "They're a family. And if you try to load them into one of those trucks, I don't think any amount of firepower you brought is going to stop what happens next." As if to prove his point, the massive creature rose slightly onto her front legs, wings spreading just enough to cast a long shadow across the yard, low sounds building in her throat that needed no translation. Every soldier along the fence line froze, and Colonel Marsh's hand drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the radio clipped to her shoulder. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself directly between the soldiers and the creature, arms still raised, voice steady despite the tremble he could feel building in his own chest. "Colonel, listen to me. You force this, and people die today, yours and possibly mine. Or you give me 5 minutes to show you something instead." Marsh studied him for a long, tense moment before giving a small, sharp nod. 5 minutes. Daniel turned and hurried into the house, returning moments later with a battered notebook, the same one he had been using for weeks to track feeding schedules and strange behaviors, along with a small stack of photos he had taken with an old digital camera, documenting everything from the night of the crater to the massive landing the evening before. He handed them over without hesitation. Every day, every change, every sign of what they are and how they've reacted, written down as it happened. If something happens to me or to them today, this doesn't stay quiet. Copies exist. People outside this property already know pieces of what's happening here. And if this turns into a firefight in my backyard, that story gets out with all of it. Marsh flipped through the notebook, expression unreadable, pausing on pages describing the hatchlings' growth, their reactions to the signal pulses, and the peaceful landing the night before. She looked up slowly, glancing again at the creature still watching the standoff with sharp, protective eyes, then back at Daniel. "You're betting a lot on the idea that we care about bad publicity." "I'm betting," Daniel said quietly, "that whoever gave you those orders would rather have a peaceful first contact story than a body count in a farmer's backyard." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Daniel wasn't sure which way it would break. Then, slowly, Colonel Marsh closed the notebook and signaled behind her with a small, controlled gesture. One by one, the soldiers along the fence line lowered their weapons fully and began stepping back toward the vehicles. "This isn't over, Mr. Reeves," Marsh said, tucking the notebook under her arm. "But it's not happening today, either." As the convoy pulled away down the gravel driveway, Daniel finally let his raised arms fall, legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. Flint and Glimmer pressed close against him immediately, and behind him, the massive creature lowered herself back down onto the grass with a long, heavy breath, tension easing from her powerful frame. Daniel didn't know how much time he had bought, or what Colonel Marsh's superiors would decide once that notebook reached them. But for now, standing in his ruined backyard surrounded by the strange, impossible family that had chosen him without asking permission, that single, uncertain moment of peace felt like enough. Autumn came early that year, and for the first time in longer than Daniel Reese could remember, he found himself looking forward to the cold instead of dreading the extra work it always brought. 3 weeks had passed since Colonel Marsh's convoy pulled out of his driveway, and though official vehicles still passed by the property more often than Daniel liked, no one had come back to demand the family living in his backyard be handed over. Whatever the notebook and photographs had convinced her superiors of, it seemed enough, for now, to leave them alone. Daniel suspected it wouldn't stay that way forever, but for now, he allowed himself to simply enjoy the quiet that had settled back over his land. The creature Flint and Glimmer called Mother had not left either. Her name, Daniel eventually learned, wasn't spoken so much as felt, a low resonant hum that vibrated faintly through the ground whenever she wanted his attention, something his human mouth could never fully copy. After weeks of trying, he had settled on calling her Sable, for the deep, near-black color her scales turned whenever the sun set behind the hills, and though she never confirmed the name meant anything close to correct, she answered to it anyway, tilting her massive head whenever he called it across the yard. She had reshaped the back half of his property without asking, flattening a wide clearing near the tree line that had slowly become something between a nest and a permanent shelter, built from broken timber, packed earth, and stone. She moved herself with an ease that still made Daniel's stomach twist a little every time he watched it happen. He had stopped bothering to mow that section of grass weeks ago. Flint and Glimmer had grown considerably since the crater first appeared behind the barn, though nowhere near their mother's size, and Daniel suspected, based on the careful way Sable still watched over them, that it would be a long while yet before they were anything close to fully grown. Flint had taken to short, clumsy test flights across the yard, usually ending in a tumble through the grass that left him more excited than embarrassed. Glimmer preferred staying closer to the ground, though the static sparks that once jumped nervously from her claws now came under far more control, enough that she had started using them, carefully, to help Daniel start the evening fire without needing matches. The town, predictably, had not stayed quiet about any of it. Warren Locke had stopped pretending he didn't know something unusual lived on Daniel's property, though after one very direct, very close encounter with Sable during a routine inspection, he had developed a newfound talent for filing paperwork that avoided mentioning specific details. Rumors spread through town regardless, wild stories growing more exaggerated with each retelling. But Daniel found he no longer minded the attention nearly as much as he once might have. Let people talk. None of them were foolish enough to come try anything themselves. What surprised Daniel most, in the quiet weeks that followed the standoff, wasn't Sable's size or her strength, both of which remained obvious every time she moved. It was how much of her seemed to soften, slowly, the longer she stayed. She began following Daniel at a careful distance while he worked around the farm, watching him repair fences and machinery with the same unreadable patience she once used to watch her own children. One evening, after he had spent an hour struggling with a stubborn engine part on his old tractor, she had simply reached out with one claw, applying the exact careful pressure needed to loosen the bolt he had been fighting with for far too long. Daniel had stared at her for a long moment afterward, wrench still in hand. "You've been paying attention," he said, half amused, half something closer to touched. Her only response was a low, satisfied rumble, and from that point on, fixing things around the farm became something closer to a shared task than a solitary chore. Late one night, weeks into their strange new arrangement, Daniel sat on the porch steps with Flint and Glimmer curled on either side of him, watching Sable settle down near the tree line, wings folding slowly around herself the way she always did before sleep. He thought back to the night this all began, the smell of scorched grass, the fear that had gripped him standing at the edge of that crater, and how close he had come to simply calling someone else to deal with it instead of stepping down into that hole in the earth himself. He didn't regret it. Not once, not for a single moment since. Somewhere beyond his fence line, beyond the quiet hills and the small, curious town that had slowly learned to accept the impossible family living on the Reeves property, the wider world was undoubtedly still watching, still wondering what this meant for a planet that had just quietly proven it was not alone in the universe. Daniel understood there would be more visitors eventually, more questions, more decisions far bigger than anything happening in his backyard. Colonel Marsh's warning still echoed in the back of his mind. This isn't over. But tonight, none of that mattered as much as the two small, warm bodies pressed against his sides, breathing slow and even, finally, completely safe. Tonight, what mattered was Sable's steady presence a short distance away, watching over all three of them with the same quiet devotion she had crossed unknown distances to find. Daniel reached out and rested a hand gently on Flint's back, then Glimmers, feeling the soft, steady thrum of life beneath his palm. Whatever the future eventually brought, whatever the wider galaxy decided to make of one stubborn, ordinary man who refused to let go of two lost creatures that fell out of the sky, Daniel Reeves knew exactly where he stood. He was Dad, and he wasn't going anywhere.